The presidential train pulled into Union Station at 11:45 a.m. on September 28, 1919. Woodrow Wilson hadn't spoken in 3 days. Inside car number 1, the President of the United States sat motionless, his left side completely numb, his vision blurring at the edges. His wife, Edith, held his hand. Neither of them knew that democracy itself was about to go dark. 4 days earlier, Wilson had stood before 8,000 people in Pueblo, Colorado, delivering what witnesses would later call the most emotional speech of his career. His voice had cracked when he spoke about the mothers who'd lost sons in the Great War. Tears had streamed down his face as he described the graves in France. Rows of white crosses stretching to the horizon. The League of Nations, he'd told them, was humanity's only hope to prevent another slaughter. His hands had trembled on the podium. Sweat had soaked through his collar despite the cool September evening. When he'd finished, the crowd had risen in thunderous applause. Wilson had walked off stage and collapsed in the arms of his personal physician, Dr. Cary Grayson. The tour had been Wilson's last desperate gambit. For 8,000 miles, he'd crisscrossed the country in a private train, delivering 40 speeches in 22 days. The Senate wouldn't ratify his Treaty of Versailles. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge and his Republican allies had the votes to block it. So Wilson had done what he always did when Washington opposed him. He'd gone directly to the people. But the people were killing him. Literally. Each speech drained him a little more. The headaches had started in Kansas City, sharp pains that felt like ice picks behind his left eye. In Salt Lake City, he'd vomited before going on stage. In Sacramento, his left hand had gone numb for 20 minutes. Dr. Grayson had begged him to stop. Edith had pleaded with him to rest. Wilson had refused. The League mattered more than his health, he'd said. The League mattered more than anything. The train car smelled of stale coffee and leather polish. Wilson sat in an overstuffed chair, staring at nothing. His face had gone gray, the color of wet concrete. When Edith touched his cheek, his skin felt cold and clammy. Grayson had taken his pulse 6 times in the last hour. Each time, the doctor's expression had grown more worried. Outside the window, Washington slipped past. Familiar buildings. The dome of the Capitol. Home. But Wilson didn't seem to see any of it. Edith hadn't slept since Pueblo. She'd sat beside her husband for 3 days and nights, watching him deteriorate. The numbness in his left side had spread from his hand to his arm to his entire left leg. He could barely stand without assistance. His speech had become slurred, words running together like watercolors in rain. When reporters had tried to board the train in Cheyenne, Grayson had physically blocked them. The president was suffering from nervous exhaustion, the doctor had told them. He needed rest. Nothing serious. Nothing to alarm the nation. The lie had come easily to Grayson. He'd been lying about Wilson's health for months. The episodes had started back in April, shortly after Wilson had returned from the Paris Peace Conference. Moments where the president's words would slur mid-sentence. Times when his left eye would twitch uncontrollably, the lid fluttering like a trapped moth. Once, during a cabinet meeting, Wilson had forgotten the Secretary of Agriculture's name. He'd called him, "that fellow with the farming business," and then continued as if nothing had happened. Only Grayson had noticed. Only Grayson had understood what it meant. But here's what the newspapers didn't report, what Grayson's official statements never mentioned. The doctor had seen this coming for months. He'd written letters to Edith, careful letters marked personal and confidential, warning her that the president's blood pressure was dangerously high, that the headaches indicated possible mini-strokes, that Wilson's brain was literally deteriorating under the stress. Edith had read every letter. Then she'd burned them all in the fireplace of the White House residence. No one could know. If the Senate learned Wilson was weak, they'd destroy the treaty. If the press discovered he was ill, they'd call for his resignation. The League of Nations would die before it was born. The train slowed as it approached the platform. Journalists waited behind rope barriers. Cameras pointed at car number 1 like weapons. Grayson turned to Edith. They needed a plan. Wilson couldn't walk off this train unassisted. He could barely sit upright. If the press saw him like this, if photographers captured the president's vacant stare and trembling hands, the headlines would scream incapacity. The government would fracture. Everything Wilson had fought for would collapse. Edith made the decision in seconds. They would exit through the rear of the train, away from the cameras. A car would be waiting. Wilson would be helped down the steps by Secret Service agents. Anyone watching would see the president being assisted, yes, but assisted by guards. Not carried, not dragged. Helped, like any tired man returning from a long journey. The distinction mattered. Tired could be explained. Incapacitated could not. The plan worked. Photographers caught glimpses of Wilson through gaps in the crowd, but no clear shots. The president waved weakly with his right hand as Secret Service agents guided him toward the waiting Cadillac. To casual observers, he looked exhausted but functional. Only those standing close enough could see that his eyes weren't focusing on anything in particular. Only those who knew him well could notice that his left hand hung limp at his side, fingers curled into a useless claw. The drive to the White House took 18 minutes. Wilson didn't speak. Edith sat beside him, her hand on his knee, feeling the muscle tremors through the fabric of his trousers. She thought about everything that had led to this moment. The whirlwind romance after his first wife had died. Their wedding just 16 months into his presidency. The way Washington society had whispered that it was too soon, too scandalous. She'd gone from being a Virginia widow who ran a jewelry business to being First Lady of the United States in less than a year. She'd had 9 years of formal education. She couldn't speak French. She'd never been to Europe before the Paris Peace Conference. And now she sat in this car, watching the man she loved disappear before her eyes, knowing that somehow she would have to hold everything together. They entered the White House through the south portico. Staff had been instructed to stay away from the entrance. Only Joseph Tumulty, Wilson's personal secretary, waited inside. He'd served Wilson for 8 years. He knew the president's moods, his mannerisms, his tells. One look at Wilson's face told Tumulty everything. This wasn't exhaustion. This was something worse. Grayson helped Wilson up the stairs to the private residence. Each step took effort. Wilson's right leg worked, but his left leg dragged, the foot scraping against the carpet. At the landing, he paused to catch his breath. His lips had turned slightly blue. When he tried to speak, asking for water, the word came out garbled. "Why do?" Edith understood. She always understood. She hurried ahead to the bedroom, calling for a maid to bring ice water and to prepare the bed. The bedroom was on the second floor, overlooking the south lawn. Wilson had slept in this room for 6 years. It had been his refuge. Now it would become his prison, though he didn't know that yet. Grayson helped him into bed. Wilson still wore his suit, too weak to change. The doctor loosened his collar and removed his shoes. Wilson's left shoe came off easily. His right foot had swollen during the train ride, the leather tight against inflamed flesh. Edith sat on the edge of the bed and held Wilson's right hand. His grip was weak but present. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since Pueblo. His eyes cleared for just a moment. He whispered her name. Just that. Edith. Then his eyelids drooped and he was asleep. She sat there for an hour, watching him breathe, the rise and fall of his chest, the occasional twitch of his right hand, the absolute stillness of his left side. Grayson stood by the window, staring out at the October twilight settling over Washington. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. They both knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Over the next 3 days, Wilson stayed in bed. Grayson examined him daily. The numbness in his left side wasn't improving. His blood pressure remained dangerously elevated. The headaches continued, sometimes so severe that Wilson couldn't bear to have the curtains open. Edith managed the outside world. She told Tumulty to cancel all appointments. She instructed the staff to tell callers that the president was resting and recovering nicely. She personally screened all visitors to the second floor. No one saw Wilson except her, Grayson, and the president's personal valet. The cabinet grew restless. Secretary of State Robert Lansing sent 3 requests for meetings. Edith declined them all. The British ambassador wanted to discuss critical issues regarding the occupation of Germany. Edith told him the president would be available next week. Senators asked about the treaty. Edith said Wilson was reviewing their concerns. Everything was fine. Everything was under control. The president just needed a few days of rest. But on the morning of October 2, 1919, 4 days after returning to Washington, everything changed forever. Wilson woke at 5 in the morning. He needed to use the bathroom. He'd always been an early riser, disciplined about his routine. He swung his legs out of bed and stood, or tried to stand. His left leg buckled immediately. He crashed to the floor, his head striking the nightstand. The sound was singular, heavy, final. A sound like a book dropping from a great height. Edith heard it from the adjoining bedroom. She'd been sleeping lightly, waking at every sound. Now she bolted upright, her heart hammering. She ran to Wilson's room and found him on the floor, conscious but unable to move. His left side was completely paralyzed. His face had gone slack on the left, the corner of his mouth drooping. When he tried to speak, nothing came out but garbled sounds. She knelt beside him, her nightgown pooling on the cold floor. She took his right hand and felt a weak squeeze. His eyes looked at her with perfect clarity. He understood what was happening to him. He knew this was catastrophic. And in that moment of shared terror, Edith made a choice that would alter American history. She didn't scream for help. She didn't run into the hallway shouting for doctors. She stood up calmly and walked to the telephone in the study. She called Grayson's personal line and spoke in a measured voice. The president had taken a fall. Could the doctor come immediately? Discreetly, through the private entrance. Tell no one. Then she returned to Wilson and sat with him until Grayson arrived. She stroked his face. She whispered that everything would be all right. She promised him that she would protect him. And somewhere in those 15 minutes, sitting on the floor of the White House bedroom with her paralyzed husband, Edith Wilson began to understand that she was no longer just the First Lady. Whether the Constitution acknowledged it or not, whether anyone would ever know it or not, she had just become the most powerful person in America. If these kinds of historical dominoes intrigue you, the small moments that toppled empires and changed the course of nations, hitting that like button helps us uncover more of these hidden turning points together. Grayson arrived within 20 minutes, carrying a leather medical bag and wearing an expression of controlled panic. He examined Wilson on the bedroom floor, checking vital signs, testing reflexes, asking questions that Wilson couldn't answer. After 10 minutes, Grayson looked at Edith and shook his head. This was a massive cerebral thrombosis. A stroke. The left side of Wilson's brain had been damaged, possibly destroyed. The paralysis might be permanent. They moved Wilson back to the bed with the help of the valet, Isaac Scott, who'd served Wilson since his Princeton days. Scott had seen the president through 2 terms, through a world war, through the death of his first wife. But he'd never seen him like this. Helpless. Broken. Scott's hands trembled as he helped lift the president's limp body. Edith dismissed Scott immediately after. She told him that the president had fallen. Nothing serious, just needed rest. Scott nodded. But his eyes said he didn't believe her. She would have to deal with him later. Right now, she needed to talk to Grayson alone. They stood by the window, speaking in whispers, while Wilson lay motionless in the bed behind them. Grayson explained the situation in clinical terms. The stroke had been severe. Wilson might recover some function, or he might not. He would almost certainly be cognitively impaired. His ability to serve as president was now in serious question. Edith asked the only question that mattered. What were their options? Grayson said there was really only one option. Wilson should resign. The vice president, Thomas Marshall, would assume the office. It was the right thing to do. The constitutional thing to do. Edith looked at Grayson for a long moment. Then she said no. The doctor blinked. Excuse me? Edith repeated herself. No, the president would not resign. He had given everything for the League of Nations. He had sacrificed his health, his peace, everything. And now, when the treaty hung in the balance, when one more month of presidential pressure might make a difference, now they would force him out? No, absolutely not. Grayson tried to explain. Mrs. Wilson, the president can't even speak. He can't sign documents. He can barely move. How could he possibly govern? Edith's response was immediate and absolute. He wouldn't govern. Not directly. She would help him. She would be his eyes and ears. She would screen what needed his attention and handle everything else. It would only be temporary. A few weeks, maybe a month. Just until he recovered enough to resume his duties. The doctor started to argue, then stopped. He'd known Edith for years. He'd watched her transform from a nervous new first lady into a formidable political operator. He'd seen her handle foreign dignitaries, manage complex social situations, advise her husband on political strategy. She was intelligent and determined. But this was something else entirely. This was proposing to run the country without authority, without transparency, without any constitutional basis whatsoever. Edith saw his hesitation and pressed her advantage. Who else could they trust? Tumulty? He was loyal but lacked the political acumen. The cabinet? They were already circling, looking for weakness. Marshall? The man was terrified of responsibility. No, it had to be her. And it had to be secret. If the press found out, if Congress discovered the truth, they would use it to destroy everything Wilson had fought for. The treaty would die, the League would die, and her husband's legacy would be reduced to a cautionary tale about power and pride. Grayson asked how they would hide a presidential stroke. You couldn't hide something like this. People would need to see the president. Decisions would need to be made. Cabinet meetings would need to happen. Edith had an answer for everything. They would say Wilson needed complete rest. No visitors except by special permission. All communications would go through her first. She would determine what required Wilson's input and what didn't. On good days, when Wilson's mind was clearer, he could review important documents. On bad days, she would make the decisions. No one would know the difference. It was insane, unconstitutional, unprecedented. Grayson knew all of this, but he also knew that the alternative was political chaos at a moment when the country couldn't afford it. The Treaty of Versailles sat before the Senate. American troops still occupied parts of Europe. Labor strikes were paralyzing major cities. The country needed stability. And perhaps, just perhaps, Edith could provide it. At least for a little while. He agreed. God help him, he agreed. But on one condition. They needed another doctor. Someone with more expertise in strokes. Someone who could give them an honest assessment of Wilson's prognosis. Edith nodded. Bring in whoever you trust. But they must be sworn to absolute secrecy. That afternoon, Dr. Francis Dercum arrived at the White House through a side entrance. He was one of the country's leading neurologists. Grayson had called him, explaining only that the president needed a confidential consultation. Dercum examined Wilson for over an hour. When he emerged from the bedroom, his face was grim. The three of them met in Edith's sitting room. Dercum's diagnosis was unambiguous. President Wilson had suffered a catastrophic stroke. The damage was extensive and likely permanent. He would probably never fully recover his physical or cognitive abilities. In Dercum's professional opinion, Wilson should resign immediately. Edith asked what would happen if he didn't resign. Dercum said that attempting to continue in office would be dangerous for both Wilson and the country. The stress could trigger another stroke. The responsibility could overwhelm his damaged brain, and the deception would eventually collapse under its own weight. She thanked Dercum for his honesty. Then she told him that Wilson would not resign. The president had made the decision himself, she said. Before the examination, during a moment of clarity, he told her he would never abandon his post. Dercum looked skeptical. He'd just spent an hour with Wilson. The man could barely string 3 words together. When exactly had this conversation happened? Edith met his eyes without flinching. She said it had happened this morning, before the fall. Dercum could either believe her or not, but either way the decision was made. The president would remain in office. The question now was whether Dercum would help them or abandon them. Dercum sat in silence for several minutes. Then he asked what she needed from him. Edith's answer was simple. His silence, his expertise when Wilson needed it, and his willingness to support their story to anyone who asked. In return, she would ensure that Wilson received the best possible care. The neurologist agreed, not because he thought it was right, not because he believed it would work, but because he understood that Edith Wilson would proceed with or without him, and if she was going to attempt this unprecedented deception, she might as well have competent medical advice. On October 6, 1919, 4 days after Woodrow Wilson's stroke, the White House implemented what they called the protocol. No one would see the president without Edith's explicit permission. All documents requiring presidential attention would be submitted to her first. Cabinet members could send written requests, which she would review and either present to Wilson or handle herself. The vice president was not informed. Congress was not notified. The American people were told that their president was suffering from nervous exhaustion and needed complete rest. The cover story was perfect. Americans had watched Wilson push himself to exhaustion on the speaking tour. The idea that he needed a few weeks of recovery seemed entirely reasonable. Editorial pages praised him for finally listening to his doctors. Political cartoons showed him sleeping peacefully while the country ran smoothly. No one suspected the truth. No one imagined that the presidency had just been handed to a woman who dropped out of school in 9th grade. No one could have predicted that American democracy was about to run on autopilot for 17 months. And no one, not even Edith herself, could have guessed that she would discover she was very, very good at being president. Edith Bowling Galt had never planned to become First Lady. She'd certainly never imagined running the country. Her story was supposed to be simpler, quieter. A Virginia girl who'd married a jeweler, run his business after he died, and lived comfortably on the proceeds. Then, in March 1915, She'd been invited to tea at the White House by her friend Helen Bones, President Wilson's cousin. Wilson had joined them. He was a widower then, still mourning his wife Ellen, who'd died the previous year. He'd looked tired and sad. Edith had felt sorry for him. 3 months later, they were engaged. Washington society had been scandalized. The president's first wife had been dead less than a year. Protocol demanded at least 2 years of mourning. But Wilson didn't care about protocol. He was 58 years old and desperately lonely. Edith was 43, intelligent, and completely unintimidated by his position. She told him the truth when his advisors told him what he wanted to hear. She challenged him when others deferred. Within weeks of their first meeting, Wilson was writing her love letters that ran 10 pages long. They married in December 1915, and Edith stepped into a role she was utterly unprepared for. She had 9 years of formal education. She dropped out of school when she was 15. She couldn't speak French, which was embarrassing given how much time first ladies were expected to spend with European dignitaries. She'd never traveled outside the United States before marrying Wilson. Her first time in Europe had been the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, where she'd sat at dinner tables with kings and prime ministers, frantically trying to remember which fork to use. But Edith had something more valuable than education. She had instinct. She could read a room in seconds. She knew when men were lying to her husband, when advisors were pushing their own agendas, when senators were pretending to support Wilson while sabotaging him behind his back. Wilson had learned to trust her judgment. During the war, he'd consulted her on major decisions. She'd sat in on strategy sessions. She'd decoded messages using a cipher he'd taught her. By 1919, she was more than his wife. She was his closest advisor, his confidant, the person who understood his mind better than anyone. Now, on the morning of October 2nd, 1919, as she stared at her husband lying paralyzed in his bed, all of that preparation would finally matter. Grayson and Durkham had examined Wilson. They'd delivered their verdict: the president should resign. The country needed leadership he could no longer provide. It was tragic, but necessary. The constitutional path forward was clear. Edith's response had been equally clear: no. The doctors had seemed genuinely surprised. "Mrs. Wilson," they'd said, "surely you understand the gravity of the situation. The president cannot speak clearly. He cannot move his left side. He requires constant medical supervision. How could he possibly fulfill his duties?" Edith had listened to their arguments. Then she dismissed them with 4 words that would echo through history: "I'll do it myself." Not "we'll manage," not "we'll get through this," "I'll do it myself." As if running the United States government was no different than running her late husband's jewelry business. As if constitutional governance was simply a matter of will and determination. The sheer audacity of it had left both doctors momentarily speechless. But Edith wasn't being audacious. She was being practical. She'd watched her husband govern for 4 years. She'd seen how decisions were made, how power flowed through the White House, how the machinery of government actually worked. Most of it was routine. Cabinet members handled their departments. The bureaucracy managed day-to-day operations. What the president actually did was make final decisions on major issues, sign legislation, manage foreign relations, and provide leadership during crises. Edith was confident she could handle the first 3. The 4th was trickier, but she'd cross that bridge if she came to it. The plan she outlined to Grayson and Durkham was deceptively simple. All documents would come to her first. She would review them and sort them into 3 categories: routine matters that didn't require presidential attention, which she would handle or delegate; important but not urgent matters, which she would save for Wilson's better days; and critical issues that needed immediate presidential input, which she would present to Wilson during his moments of clarity. Grayson had asked the obvious question: what if Wilson disagrees with your assessment? What if he thinks something is important that you've decided is routine? Edith had smiled. Then I'll defer to his judgment, she'd said. But if he's not capable of making that judgment on a particular day, someone has to make it. Would you prefer the vice president, a man who'd never shown the slightest interest in governing, or the cabinet, which was already divided into hostile factions? Or perhaps we should just let the government drift rudderless while my husband recovers. Durkheim had pointed out the fundamental flaw in her logic. Mrs. Wilson, the Constitution makes no provision for what you're proposing. The president either serves or he doesn't. There's no middle ground. If Wilson cannot fulfill his duties, the vice president must assume them. That's not a suggestion. That's the law. Edith's response had been coldly precise. The Constitution says the vice president assumes power if the president is unable to discharge his duties. It doesn't define what unable means. Wilson can still think. He can still make decisions. He simply needs assistance communicating them. I'm providing that assistance. Where exactly does the Constitution prohibit that? The legal argument was absurd, and everyone in the room knew it. But it was just plausible enough to provide cover, just defensible enough to create ambiguity. And ambiguity was all Edith needed. If no one could definitively prove Wilson was incapacitated, if there remained any possibility that he was still making decisions even with help, then constitutional crisis could be avoided. The key was maintaining the fiction that Wilson remained in charge. She'd given the doctors 24 hours to help her develop that fiction. They would determine Wilson's actual capabilities. What could he do? What couldn't he do? On his best days, how lucid was he? On his worst days, how impaired? They needed to map the landscape of his disability so Edith could navigate it without revealing it to the world. The examination took place that afternoon. Grayson and Durkheim spent 3 hours testing Wilson's cognitive and physical functions. The results were sobering. Wilson's left side was completely paralyzed. The paralysis extended from his face down through his leg. He would never walk normally again. His left arm hung useless. His vision was damaged. He could only see clearly from his right eye. The left eye perceived everything as shadows and blurs. But the cognitive damage was more complex. Wilson's mind hadn't been destroyed. It had been fragmented. Some functions remained intact. He could still read, though slowly and with difficulty. He could still understand complex concepts when they were explained carefully. His memory of past events was sharp. He could recall conversations from years ago with perfect clarity. What he had lost was executive function, the ability to synthesize information and make decisions, the capacity to weigh multiple factors simultaneously, the mental stamina to focus for more than 20 or 30 minutes. His mind was like a library after an earthquake. All the books were still there, but the organizational system had been destroyed. Finding the right information required patience and luck. There were also the mood swings. Wilson had always been emotional, prone to passionate speeches and occasional tears. Now those emotions came untethered. He would cry without warning. He would rage at perceived slights. He would sink into depressions that lasted hours. Then, just as suddenly, he would emerge, clear-headed and determined, speaking with his old authority for brief windows before the fog returned. Edith listened to all of this without visible emotion. She asked practical questions. How long did the clear periods last? Usually 30 minutes to an hour, Grayson said. Sometimes less. Could they predict when Wilson would be lucid? Not reliably, Durkheim admitted. Sometimes he was sharp in the mornings. Sometimes the afternoons were better. There seemed to be no pattern. She thanked them for their honesty. Then she told them what would happen next. Starting tomorrow, the White House would announce that President Wilson was suffering from nervous exhaustion and required complete rest. No visitors except family and essential staff. All communications would be handled through her. The president was following doctors' orders and would resume normal activities when his health permitted. Grayson had protested weakly. "Mrs. Wilson, this can't last. Eventually someone will demand proof that the president is competent. The cabinet will insist on seeing him. Congress will require his presence. You can't hide him forever." Edith had nodded. "You're absolutely right. I can't hide him forever. But I don't need forever. I need a few weeks. Maybe a month. Just long enough for the immediate crisis to pass. For the treaty fight to resolve. For things to stabilize. Then we'll reassess." But here's what Edith didn't tell the doctors. What she barely admitted to herself in those first frantic days. She had no intention of letting Wilson resign. Not in a few weeks. Not in a few months. Not ever, if she could help it. Because somewhere between the moment she'd found him on the bedroom floor and the moment she'd dismissed Durkheim's advice, Edith had realized something fundamental. Her husband had devoted his entire life to the League of Nations. He'd sacrificed his health, his peace, his happiness for this one cause. The idea that all nations could come together to prevent future wars. That diplomacy could replace violence. That humanity could evolve beyond its basest instincts. It was naive. It was idealistic. It was probably impossible. But it was Wilson's entire reason for being. And if he resigned now, with the treaty still unratified, with the Senate still debating, all of it would be for nothing. The League would die. His presidency would be remembered as a tragic failure. He would die knowing he'd come so close and lost everything. Edith couldn't let that happen. She loved Wilson too much. She'd watched him pour everything into this dream. She'd held him when he cried about the boys dying in France. She'd seen him work 18-hour days trying to negotiate a treaty that would make their deaths mean something. And now, when he was too weak to fight for himself, she would fight for him. Even if it meant lying to the cabinet, even if it meant deceiving Congress, even if it meant running the country without authority or acknowledgement, she would do what needed to be done. Someone had to. The protocol began on October 6th. Tumulty received a memo, written on White House stationery in what appeared to be Wilson's handwriting. The president was following medical advice and restricting all visitors. Anyone needing presidential attention should submit written requests to Mrs. Wilson. She would ensure they reached the president when appropriate. Tumulty read the memo 3 times. The handwriting looked right. The phrasing sounded like Wilson. But something felt wrong. He took his concerns to Grayson. The doctor was sympathetic but firm. The president had suffered a physical and emotional collapse, Grayson explained. His nervous system was exhausted. Any stress could trigger a complete breakdown. The restrictions were temporary but necessary. Tumulty had served Wilson too long to argue. He'd seen the president's declining health over the past months. If the doctor said he needed rest, then he needed rest. The cabinet was harder to manage. These were powerful men accustomed to access and influence. Secretary of State Robert Lansing had been in Paris during the peace negotiations. He understood foreign policy as well as Wilson did. Secretary of the Treasury Carter Glass controlled the nation's purse strings. Secretary of War Newton Baker commanded the military. They weren't accustomed to taking orders from the First Lady. Lansing was the first to push back. On October 8th, he sent a formal request to meet with the president regarding urgent Mexican border tensions. Rebel forces were threatening American oil interests. Military intervention might be necessary. The situation required immediate presidential guidance. Edith received the request and set it aside. Mexico wasn't about to invade. The oil companies could wait. This was exactly the kind of manufactured crisis she'd seen cabinet members use to pressure Wilson before. Lansing wanted to flex his authority. He wanted to remind everyone that he was Secretary of State, and she was just the president's wife. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. 2 days later, Lansing sent another request. This one was sharper. The Secretary of State required consultation on matters that could not be delayed. The Constitution mandated that the president provide guidance on foreign affairs. If the president was unable to do so, other arrangements must be made. The threat was clear. Lansing was suggesting that Wilson was incapacitated, that the vice president should assume power, that Edith's little arrangement was unconstitutional. She responded with a note written on Wilson's personal stationery. The president had reviewed the Mexican situation. He felt immediate intervention was premature. The matter should be monitored, but no action taken at present. The handwriting was perfect. Wilson's signature was flawless, because Edith had been practicing. For hours each night she sat at Wilson's desk with samples of his writing. She studied the loops of his letters, the slant of his script, the pressure he applied to different strokes. She practiced on scrap paper until her forgeries were indistinguishable from the originals. It wasn't difficult. Wilson's handwriting was distinctive but not complex, and Edith had always been good with her hands. 17 years running a jewelry business had given her a steady grip and an eye for detail. She forged his signature on routine documents, appointments that needed authorization, legislative bills that required approval or veto, executive orders that kept the government functioning. None of them were major decisions. None would change the course of history. But collectively, they maintained the illusion that President Wilson remained in charge. For the important decisions, Edith actually consulted Wilson. On his better days, when the fog lifted and his old brilliance emerged, she would bring him documents and explain the situations. Sometimes he understood immediately and dictated clear responses. Those were good days. She cherished them. Other times he would struggle, getting lost in tangents, forgetting what they had been discussing. On those days, she would gently remind him, redirect his attention, and eventually extract enough coherent thought to justify whatever decision she'd already made. And on the worst days, when Wilson couldn't focus at all, when he stared blankly at papers or became frustrated and angry, Edith made the decisions entirely on her own. Then she would sit at his desk late at night, practicing his signature, writing responses in his voice, maintaining the fiction that democracy continued uninterrupted. She discovered she was good at it, making decisions, that is, better than she'd expected. She had no formal training in governance, but she understood power. She knew that most problems solved themselves if you waited long enough. She knew that men who demanded immediate answers often settled for delayed ones if you seemed confident. She knew that the appearance of control mattered more than actual control. The White House staff noticed the changes but didn't question them. Mrs. Wilson had always been involved in the president's work. Now she was just more involved. The Secret Service saw her coming and going from the Oval Office at odd hours. They saw her carrying stacks of documents between her rooms and Wilson's. They said nothing. Their job was to protect the president, not to second-guess his arrangements. By the end of October, a rhythm had developed. Mornings, Edith would review the night's cables and urgent messages. She'd sort them into her categories. The routine matters she handled herself, signing Wilson's name with practiced ease. The important issues she saved for Wilson's afternoon sessions, when he was sometimes more alert. The truly critical matters, The ones that genuinely required presidential authority, she saved for his rare moments of perfect clarity. Those moments were becoming rarer. Wilson's condition wasn't improving. If anything, the cognitive fog was deepening. The windows of lucidity grew shorter. The emotional outbursts grew more frequent. Some days he didn't recognize his valet. Other days he thought he was still at Princeton, teaching political science. Edith would gently correct him, remind him where he was, guide him back to the present. Then she would return to her desk and continue making decisions for the United States of America. She told herself it was temporary, that Wilson would recover, that soon he'd be strong enough to resume his full duties, and this strange interregnum would end. But somewhere in her heart, in a place she didn't examine too closely, Edith knew the truth. Wilson would never fully recover. This arrangement, this unprecedented shadow presidency, would continue as long as she willed it to continue, and she had no intention of stopping. Because power, once tasted, becomes necessary. Not for its own sake, though that was part of it, but because letting go meant admitting defeat. It meant acknowledging that Wilson's great dream was dying. It meant watching everything he'd fought for crumble while he lay helpless in bed. Edith couldn't do that to him. She wouldn't. So she forged his signatures, she made his decisions, she spoke with his authority. And slowly, carefully, she became President of the United States in everything but name. The Constitution said nothing about this. The founders had never imagined this scenario. A First Lady effectively running the country while her husband lay paralyzed. It was unprecedented, it was probably illegal. It was definitely necessary. Or at least, that's what Edith told herself late at night, alone at Wilson's desk, practicing his signature one more time before signing another executive order that would affect millions of lives. Someone had to govern. Someone had to make decisions. Someone had to keep the machinery running while the elected president slowly vanished into the fog of his damaged brain. That someone was Edith Wilson, and for the next 17 months, she would do exactly that. Edith called it her stewardship. The word was carefully chosen. A steward manages property for someone else. A steward doesn't own, doesn't command, doesn't rule. A steward simply maintains, protects, preserves. It was a comforting fiction, one that allowed Edith to exercise presidential power while denying she held it. She wasn't making decisions, she would later claim. She was simply determining what required the president's attention and what didn't. A subtle distinction. A meaningless distinction, but a distinction that would shield her from accusations of usurping power. The daily routine established itself quickly. Each morning, Edith woke at 6. She would check on Wilson first, speaking quietly with a night nurse about how he'd slept, whether he'd been agitated, whether he'd had any moments of clarity. Then she would dress and descend to the small study adjacent to the Oval Office, where overnight cables and messages had accumulated in neat stacks. Tumulty had arranged the system. All documents requiring presidential action came to this study first. Foreign dispatches from the State Department. Legislative bills from Congress. Policy recommendations from cabinet members. Requests for appointments. Applications for pardons. Every piece of paper that would normally land on the president's desk now landed on Edith's. She would spend 2 hours reading through everything. Her education might have ended in 9th grade, but 4 years as First Lady had taught her to read bureaucratic language. She understood the difference between urgent and important. She could spot when a cabinet member was trying to manipulate presidential authority for departmental advantage. She knew which issues were genuinely critical and which were merely dressed up to seem that way. The documents sorted themselves into 3 piles. The first pile contained routine matters: appointments to minor positions, acknowledgments of diplomatic correspondence, requests for information that staff could handle. Edith would make notes on these, often just a few words, and return them to Tumulty for processing. Her handwriting on these notes looked nothing like Wilson's. She wasn't trying to deceive anyone about who was making these decisions. They were too minor to matter. The second pile was more substantial: policy questions that required thought, but not immediate action. Reports on domestic issues like labor strikes or agricultural problems. These she would read carefully, making notes in the margins, and set aside for Wilson's better days. When he had a lucid afternoon, she would bring him 1 or 2 of these documents and walk him through the issues. Sometimes he grasped them immediately and dictated clear responses. Other times he struggled, and Edith would gently guide the conversation until she'd extracted enough presidential language to craft a response. The third pile was the smallest and most dangerous: truly urgent matters that required immediate presidential authority, foreign crises, constitutional questions, major legislative decisions. These couldn't wait for Wilson's clarity to return. These needed answers now. And so Edith made the decisions herself, then forged Wilson's signature on responses written in his distinctive style. She'd gotten frighteningly good at the forgery. Not just the signature, though that was now perfect, but the voice. The way Wilson constructed arguments, his tendency to use historical references, his habit of beginning important letters with philosophical observations before getting to practical matters. Edith had read thousands of his letters over the years. She'd edited his speeches. She discussed policy with him until she could predict his positions on almost any issue. Now she used that knowledge to become him. When she wrote as Wilson, she thought as Wilson. She asked herself what he would say if he were healthy, if the stroke hadn't stolen his executive function. The answers came easily. Too easily, perhaps. Because the line between channeling Wilson's voice and substituting her own judgment was dangerously thin. By November, the system was running smoothly. So smoothly that people stopped questioning it. Tumulty would bring documents to Edith's study each morning. She would return them by afternoon with notes and signatures. The government continued functioning. Laws were enacted or vetoed. Ambassadors were received or dismissed. The vast machinery of federal power ground forward without apparent interruption. But cracks were forming. Secretary of State Lansing was not a stupid man. He'd been dealing with presidential correspondence for years. He knew Wilson's habits, his rhythms, his ways of thinking. And the responses he was getting from the White House felt wrong. Not obviously wrong, just slightly off, like a piano tuned a half-step flat. The arguments were sound. The decisions were reasonable. But something in the phrasing, something in the logic, didn't quite match the Wilson he'd worked with for 6 years. On November 17th, Lansing decided to force the issue. He sent a request for an urgent meeting about Mexico. Rebel forces under Pancho Villa had attacked an American mining operation. 3 American citizens were dead. The oil companies were demanding military protection. Public pressure for intervention was building. This wasn't something that could be handled through written correspondence. The president needed to meet with his Secretary of State and make a decision about potential military action. Edith received the request at 9 in the morning. She read it twice. Lansing was clever. He'd structured his request so that refusing it would seem unreasonable. A meeting about potential military action wasn't routine business. It required presidential presence. If Wilson couldn't attend such a meeting, it would prove he was incapacitated. She considered her options. She could refuse the meeting and risk Lansing making a public issue of presidential incapacity. She could arrange the meeting but keep it brief and controlled, though Wilson's current condition made that risky. Or she could handle the Mexico situation herself and present Lansing with a presidential decision that made the meeting unnecessary. Edith chose the third option. She spent the afternoon reviewing intelligence reports on Mexico. The situation was tense, but not critical. Villa's forces were poorly organized. The mining attack appeared to be opportunistic rather than strategic. American oil interests wanted military intervention, but they always wanted military intervention. It protected their investments and intimidated the Mexican government into favorable terms. Wilson had always been skeptical of military solutions to diplomatic problems. He'd sent troops into Mexico before and regretted it. The occupation had been messy, expensive, and counterproductive. If Wilson were healthy in reviewing this situation, Edith was confident he'd urge restraint. So that's what she decided. She drafted a response on presidential stationery. The president had reviewed the Mexican situation with great concern. The deaths of American citizens were tragic and unacceptable. However, military intervention at this time would be premature and likely counterproductive. The State Department should deliver a strong diplomatic protest to the Mexican government and demand compensation for the victims' families. Additional military presence at the border would be authorized, but no offensive action should be taken without further presidential authorization. The signature was perfect. The reasoning was sound. The decision was exactly what Wilson would have made, except Wilson hadn't made it. Wilson was upstairs in bed, unable to follow a conversation for more than 10 minutes, unaware that Mexico was even under discussion. Lansing received the response that evening. He read it 3 times. Then he sat at his desk for a long while, staring at the presidential letterhead. The handwriting was Wilson's. The signature was flawless. But the decision felt like it had been made by someone else, someone more cautious, someone less willing to project American power. Wilson would have been angrier about the American deaths, more protective of American business interests abroad. This response was measured, diplomatic, almost passive. But here's what Lansing didn't know, what he couldn't have known. While he sat in his office questioning the letter's authenticity, Edith was upstairs with Wilson, trying to tell him about Mexico. The president was having a bad day. He'd woken confused, thinking he was back at Princeton. When Edith mentioned Mexico, he'd become agitated, talking about the Constitution and presidential war powers and something about James Polk. None of it made sense. His mind was skipping through decades like a broken phonograph. Edith had sat with him for an hour, trying to anchor him in the present. Eventually, he'd calmed down and fallen asleep, and she'd returned to her study to handle the rest of the day's business. Because that's what stewardship meant, making decisions when the president couldn't, protecting him from situations that would reveal his incapacity, maintaining the fiction that Woodrow Wilson remained in charge of his own government. December brought the first real test of that fiction. Lansing wasn't the only cabinet member growing suspicious. Secretary of the Interior Franklin Lane had been trying to get Wilson's approval on Western water rights for 6 weeks. Every request disappeared into the White House and emerged days later with a note from Mrs. Wilson saying the president was reviewing the matter. Lane's patience was exhausted. On December 10th, he sent a letter that crossed the line from professional frustration to constitutional challenge. If the president was too ill to handle routine departmental business, Lane wrote, perhaps it was time to invoke whatever constitutional provisions existed for presidential disability. The vice president could assume temporary authority. The cabinet could provide collective guidance. Something had to change. The government couldn't run indefinitely on written notes from the First Lady. Edith read the letter and felt ice in her stomach. This was the confrontation she'd been dreading. Lane had put it in writing. He'd suggested presidential incapacity in a document that would become part of the official record. Other cabinet members would read this. The press might get hold of it. The whole careful structure of her stewardship could collapse. She needed to respond decisively, not with another note saying the president was reviewing the matter. That would only confirm Lane's suspicions. She needed Wilson himself to respond, which meant she needed one of his rare moments of clarity, and she needed it now. For 3 days, Edith waited for Wilson to have a good morning. She monitored him constantly, watching for signs that the fog was lifting. On the morning of December 13th, she saw it. Wilson woke alert. He asked coherent questions about the date and the weather. He requested his breakfast by name rather than pointing vaguely at the food. These were the signs Edith had learned to recognize. She brought him the water rights issue, explaining it slowly and carefully. Lane's department wanted to authorize federal development of irrigation projects in Nevada and Arizona. It was a routine matter, really. The kind of thing Wilson had approved dozens of times before. But it required a presidential decision, and Lane was using it as a test case for presidential competence. Wilson listened. For 10 minutes, maybe 15, he was entirely present. His old mind reasserted itself. He asked intelligent questions about the constitutional implications of federal water policy. He referenced previous decisions from his administration. He even made a joke about Western senators and their obsession with dams. Then he dictated a brief response authorizing the project with specific conditions about environmental protections. Edith wrote furiously, capturing every word. When Wilson finished, she read it back to him. He nodded approval. She had him sign it with his own hand. The signature was shaky but genuine. This wasn't a forgery. This was actual presidential action, captured during a window of clarity that might not come again for days. She sent the letter to Lane that afternoon. The Secretary of the Interior received it and immediately recognized the difference. This was Wilson's voice, not a careful imitation, but the real thing. The references were too specific. The environmental conditions were too characteristic of Wilson's progressive politics. Lane had gotten what he asked for. Proof that the president could still make decisions. It wasn't proof that Wilson could govern consistently, but it was enough to blunt the constitutional challenge. What Lane didn't know was that capturing that letter had required 3 days of waiting, precise timing, and a bit of luck. That Wilson's clarity had lasted maybe 20 minutes before he drifted back into confusion. That, within an hour of signing the water rights authorization, Wilson had forgotten the conversation entirely. The letter was genuine, but it represented perhaps 1% of Wilson's actual daily capacity. The other 99% was exactly what Lane suspected. Edith making decisions and forging signatures. The cabinet meeting Edith scheduled for December 15th was her most audacious performance yet. She couldn't keep deferring forever. The secretaries needed to see Wilson. They needed confirmation that their president existed as something more than handwritten notes. So Edith staged what amounted to political theater. The preparation took days. She chose the timing carefully, scheduling the meeting for a mid-morning session when Wilson was usually most alert. She had him dressed in his best suit, the one that fit loosely enough to accommodate the wheelchair. She positioned him at the head of the cabinet table, with his paralyzed left side angled away from most of the secretaries. She briefed him repeatedly on who would be there and what they might ask. The morning of the meeting, Wilson was having a decent day, not perfect. His speech was still slurred, his attention span limited. But he was present. He recognized faces. He could follow simple conversations. It would have to be enough. The cabinet filed in at 10 o'clock. The shock on their faces was visible. They'd been told Wilson was recovering. They'd imagined him resting, perhaps reading in bed, gradually regaining strength. Instead, they saw a man who'd aged a decade in 2 months. His face was gaunt and gray. His left side hung motionless. When he attempted to greet them, the words came out garbled. But Edith controlled the narrative before anyone could react. "Gentlemen," she said, "the President is pleased to meet with you today. As you can see, he's recovering from his illness but remains under strict medical supervision. The doctors have authorized a brief meeting. The President will address your most urgent concerns, but we must keep this session short to avoid overtaxing him." It was a masterclass in managing expectations. By acknowledging Wilson's visible impairment while framing it as temporary and improving, Edith preempted accusations of deception. Yes, the President was sick. Yes, he was limited. But he was here, he was conscious, and he was still the President. The meeting lasted exactly 30 minutes. Edith had a clock positioned where she could see it. Each cabinet member was allowed one question or brief update. Wilson responded when he could, usually with a nod or a few words. When he couldn't formulate a response, Edith would intervene smoothly, noting the question for later presidential consideration. Secretary of Agriculture Houston asked about farm subsidies. Wilson nodded and mumbled something about supporting American agriculture. Edith clarified that the President would review specific proposals in writing. Secretary of War Baker requested authorization for troop deployments in the Philippines. Wilson stared at him blankly. Edith said the President needed more information before deciding on military matters. Then Lansing spoke. "Mr. President," he said, "there are urgent matters regarding the Treaty of Versailles that require your immediate attention. The Senate vote is approaching. We need your guidance on potential compromises." Wilson's attention sharpened. For a moment the old fire returned to his eyes. He leaned forward and spoke clearly. "No compromises. The treaty stands as written. The League of Nations cannot be gutted by reservations. America either joins as a full partner, or we betray everything those boys died for in France." His voice cracked on the last words. His right hand trembled. But the message was unmistakable. On this issue, at least, Wilson remained absolutely clear. Edith saw Lansing's expression shift. The Secretary of State had gotten his answer, though not the one he'd hoped for. He'd also gotten confirmation that on some level, Wilson was still making decisions. Misguided decisions, perhaps? Stubborn, politically suicidal decisions? But decisions nonetheless. The meeting ended when Wilson's energy visibly flagged. Edith thanked the cabinet and had them escorted out. As they left, she heard them whispering to each other. The President was clearly impaired. But was he incapacitated? That was less certain. He'd been present, he'd spoken, he'd made his position on the treaty absolutely clear. It wasn't much, but it was enough to maintain constitutional ambiguity. That night, alone in her study, Edith reviewed what she'd accomplished. She'd stage-managed a cabinet meeting. She'd presented Wilson as functional enough to remain president. She'd protected him from questions he couldn't handle while allowing him to speak on the one issue he cared about most. It had worked. The immediate crisis was averted. But the cost was becoming apparent. Each performance like this took enormous energy to orchestrate. Each forged signature carried risk of discovery. Each decision she made without Wilson's input moved her further from stewardship and closer to something else entirely. She was no longer just protecting her husband. She was actively governing, making policy, shaping the direction of the country according to her own judgment. The treaty was the perfect example. Wilson had been clear. No compromises. Die on this hill if necessary. But Edith knew that strategy was doomed. She'd been counting votes. She'd been talking to senators through back channels. The numbers weren't there. Without modifications, the treaty would fail. Wilson's legacy would end in defeat. So Edith had made a choice. She would honor Wilson's public position. She would maintain his firm stance against reservations. But privately, quietly, she would explore compromises. She would talk to moderate Republicans. She would test language that might bridge the gap. And if she found a solution, she would present it to Wilson during one of his clearer moments and hope he accepted it. It was a calculated betrayal. Using Wilson's authority while potentially contradicting his wishes, Edith justified it by telling herself she was protecting him from his own stubbornness, that she understood political reality better than he did in his diminished state, that sometimes love meant making hard choices for someone too impaired to make them for themselves. But late at night, in the quiet moments when she couldn't hide from herself, Edith knew the truth. She'd stopped being a steward. She'd become something the founders never imagined. An unelected executive. A shadow president. A woman wielding power she had no constitutional right to hold. And the most troubling part wasn't the deception. It was how natural it felt. How right. How effortlessly she'd slipped into the role of deciding what was best for America. The stewardship would continue for 13 more months, but it had already transformed into something far more significant than Edith had originally intended. She'd wanted to protect her husband. She'd ended up running the country. And somewhere in that transition, Edith Wilson had discovered something about herself she'd never known before. Given power and responsibility, given the need to make decisions that affected millions, she didn't hesitate. She didn't falter. She simply did what needed to be done. Whether history would judge her for it remained to be seen. Whether she was saving Wilson's legacy or betraying it was still unclear. But one thing was certain. American democracy had just experienced something unprecedented. And the Constitution, for all its careful balances and checks, had no mechanism to handle it. Robert Lansing had been Secretary of State for 4 years. He understood how power worked in Washington. He knew that constitutional crises didn't announce themselves with dramatic proclamations. They crept in quietly, through precedent and acceptance, until the abnormal became routine. And by January 1920, what was happening in the White House had definitely crossed from abnormal into dangerous territory. The problem was proof. Lansing knew Edith was making decisions. He knew Wilson was incapacitated beyond anything the public understood. But knowing and proving were different things. The glimpse he'd gotten during the December cabinet meeting had confirmed Wilson's physical impairment, while creating just enough ambiguity about his mental state to prevent direct challenge. The president had spoken. He'd made decisions. Terrible, politically suicidal decisions, but decisions nonetheless. So Lansing decided to try a different approach. If he couldn't remove Wilson through direct confrontation, he would build a parallel power structure. The cabinet would begin meeting regularly without the president. They would make collective decisions on routine matters. Gradually, the government would transition to functioning without presidential input. When the time came to formally invoke disability provisions, the machinery would already be in place. He started cautiously. On January 12th, he called an informal cabinet meeting, just a discussion among department heads, he told them. A chance to coordinate on overlapping issues without bothering the president during his recovery. Most of the secretaries attended. They understood what Lansing was really doing, but they also understood the necessity. Wilson had been effectively absent for 3 months. The government needed coordination somewhere. That first meeting was innocuous. Agriculture and Interior discussed water policy. State and Treasury coordinated on European relief efforts. Nothing controversial, nothing that required presidential authority. They simply talked through problems and found common ground. It felt productive. It felt like governing. Lansing called another meeting 2 weeks later, then another. By February, the cabinet was meeting twice a week without Wilson. They weren't making major policy decisions. They weren't overriding presidential authority. But they were functioning as a collective executive in ways that blurred constitutional lines. And with each meeting, the idea of governing without a fully functional president became more normalized. Edith knew exactly what Lansing was doing. Tumulty brought her reports after each cabinet session. She read the minutes and understood the strategy. Lansing was staging a slow-motion coup. Not dramatic enough to call treasonous. Not unconstitutional enough to challenge directly. Just a gradual assumption of executive power by the cabinet collective. The danger was real. If this pattern continued, if cabinet governance became accepted practice, then even if Wilson recovered some capacity, he would return to find his authority diluted. The presidency would have been fundamentally weakened. Future disabled presidents would face cabinet governments that had claimed institutional legitimacy. Edith couldn't allow that, but she also couldn't simply demand that Lansing stop. The Secretary of State would ask why. If the president was capable of governing, he needed his wife to make demands on his behalf. She needed Wilson himself to reassert authority, which meant she needed to orchestrate another demonstration of presidential capacity. The opportunity came on February 13th. Senators Albert Fall and Gilbert Hitchcock requested a meeting with the president to discuss the treaty situation. Fall was a Republican who opposed the treaty. Hitchcock was a Democrat who supported it. Together, they represented the Senate's divided opinion, and they'd made their request public, which meant Edith couldn't refuse without making Wilson appear even more incapacitated. She spent 3 days preparing Wilson for the 15-minute meeting. She reviewed the treaty situation with him repeatedly. She briefed him on Fall and Hitchcock, their positions, their personalities. She practiced responses to likely questions. Wilson's cognitive state was unpredictable, but Edith had learned to maximize his better moments through careful preparation and rigid control of circumstances. The senators arrived at 2 o'clock on February 13th. They were shown into Wilson's bedroom, where the president sat in his wheelchair, positioned to hide his paralyzed left side. Heavy blankets covered him from the waist down. The room was dimly lit, making it harder to see details of his condition. Edith sat nearby, close enough to intervene if necessary. Fall spoke first. "Mr. President," he said, "we're all praying for your recovery." Wilson nodded and mumbled thanks. Hitchcock asked about the treaty. Would the president consider any modifications to secure Senate passage? Wilson's response was clear, if slow. No modifications. The treaty was sacred. America must join the League as a full partner, or not at all. It was exactly what he'd said in December, the same stubborn position that was killing his entire legacy. But it proved he could articulate policy positions. For 14 minutes, the senators asked questions, and Wilson provided brief answers. Some responses were sharp. Others were vague, but he was unmistakably present and engaged. Then Fall made a mistake. He leaned forward to hear Wilson better, and from his new angle he could see the president's left hand resting in his lap. The fingers were locked in a rigid claw, the skin mottled and discolored from poor circulation. Fall's expression flickered. Just for a second. But long enough for Edith to notice. She ended the meeting immediately. The president was tiring, she said. The doctors had authorized only 15 minutes. The senators thanked Wilson and departed. In the hallway, Fall turned to Hitchcock and said something that would be widely reported. "I have been very much reassured. The president is in full mental and physical vigor. He's perfectly able to handle the situation." It was a lie. Fall had seen the paralyzed hand. He'd noticed Wilson's slurred speech and limited responses. But politically, Fall couldn't admit Wilson was incapacitated without triggering a constitutional crisis that might help the treaty's chances. Better to maintain the fiction that Wilson was capable but stubborn. That way, when the treaty failed, it would be Wilson's fault rather than Republican obstruction. The visit served Edith's purposes perfectly. Fall's public statement about Wilson's vigor undercut any suggestion that the president was too impaired to govern. Lansing couldn't claim Wilson was incapacitated when a Republican senator had just declared him fully capable. The constitutional challenge was blunted. But Lansing wasn't finished. On February 20th, he sent Edith a formal memorandum. The Secretary of State believed the current arrangement was constitutionally questionable. All presidential communications should go through proper channels. Cabinet meetings should include the president or be officially authorized in his absence. The administration needed to clarify the president's actual status and role. It was a direct challenge. Lansing was forcing the issue. Either admit Wilson was incapacitated and invoke disability provisions, or allow the president to resume normal functions, including cabinet attendance. The middle ground Edith had carved out was unsustainable. Edith read the memo 3 times. Then she did something that would haunt Lansing for the rest of his career. She wrote a response on presidential stationery and forged Wilson's signature with particular care. The letter was brief and devastating. The president had noted Secretary Lansing's concerns. However, the president had also learned that Secretary Lansing had been calling cabinet meetings without presidential authorization. While the president appreciated the secretary's initiative during the president's illness, such meetings overstepped constitutional bounds. The president therefore accepted Secretary Lansing's resignation, effective immediately. Lansing received the letter on February 23rd. He read it in disbelief. He was being fired for trying to keep the government functioning during the president's incapacity. The accusation of constitutional overreach was absurd, coming from an administration where the First Lady made all decisions. But the letter bore Wilson's signature. It was official presidential action. Lansing could have fought it. He could have demanded a face-to-face meeting with Wilson. He could have gone public with his suspicions about who really wrote that letter. But he was 63 years old and tired. 4 years of war and peace negotiations had exhausted him. And honestly, part of him was relieved. The treaty was dying. The administration was in chaos. Getting out now meant avoiding the catastrophe he saw coming. He resigned quietly. In his resignation letter, he noted that he'd served to the best of his ability during challenging times. He made no mention of constitutional concerns or irregular procedures. Whatever Lansing thought about Edith's stewardship, he wasn't going to trigger a public crisis on his way out the door. But here's what the history books don't tell you. On the same day Lansing received his termination letter, Vice President Thomas Marshall was having lunch with 3 senators. They asked him directly, if the cabinet determined Wilson was incapacitated, would Marshall assume the presidency? Marshall's answer was unequivocal. No, absolutely not. He would not participate in what he called a coup against a sitting president. If Wilson wanted to resign, that was Wilson's choice. But Marshall wouldn't be party to removing him. The senators pressed. What if Wilson was genuinely unable to perform his duties? What if the country needed leadership he couldn't provide? Marshall's response revealed the deeper truth about why Edith's stewardship succeeded. Nobody wanted the responsibility. The vice president didn't want to become president under these circumstances. The cabinet didn't want to stage a constitutional confrontation. Congress didn't want to get involved in executive branch dysfunction. Everyone preferred to maintain the fiction that Wilson was recovering and would soon resume full duties. Edith understood this psychology perfectly. Americans wanted stability. They wanted to believe their government was functioning normally. They didn't want constitutional crises or disability debates or questions about whether a woman was secretly running the country. So Edith gave them what they wanted. She maintained appearances. She produced just enough evidence of Wilson's capacity to create plausible deniability. And most importantly, she kept the government functioning well enough that people could convince themselves everything was fine. The cabinet revolt that never quite happened taught Edith important lessons. She couldn't prevent all challenges to Wilson's authority, but she could control the narrative around those challenges. She could create enough ambiguity that direct confrontation seemed premature. And she could selectively use Wilson himself, parading him out during his better moments to prove he was still capable of some level of engagement. After Lansing's departure, the remaining cabinet members got the message. The president might be impaired, but he was still president. Anyone who challenged that too directly would be removed. Better to work within the system Edith had created. Better to submit requests and receive responses from Mrs. Wilson and pretend this was somehow normal. The new Secretary of State was Bainbridge Colby, a Wilson loyalist who understood the arrangement from day one. Edith briefed him personally. The president was recovering but needed assistance managing his workload. Important matters would be presented to him. Routine matters would be handled through proper channels. Mrs. Wilson would coordinate everything to ensure the president wasn't overtaxed. Colby accepted this without question. He'd watched Lansing's fate. He had no intention of challenging presidential authority or questioning the First Lady's role. He simply did his job and submitted all decisions for presidential approval through Edith. It was efficient. It was smooth. It was exactly what Edith needed. By March 1920, the pattern was firmly established. Cabinet members submitted recommendations in writing. Edith reviewed them and either presented them to Wilson during lucid moments or handled them herself. Responses came back on presidential stationery with Wilson's signature. Nobody asked questions. Nobody demanded meetings. The machinery of government continued operating, powered by a combination of bureaucratic inertia and collective willful ignorance. But the cost was mounting. Every forged signature added to Edith's legal exposure. Every decision made without Wilson's real input moved her further from stewardship into outright governance. She told herself it was temporary, that Wilson would recover, that soon she could step back and return to being just the First Lady. Deep down, though, Edith knew better. Wilson's condition wasn't improving. The cognitive islands were getting smaller and rarer. The man she'd married was disappearing into the wreckage of his stroke, leaving behind a shell that could sometimes articulate familiar positions but couldn't sustain complex thought. She was managing a performance, not assisting a recovery. The realization should have frightened her, should have made her question what she was doing. Instead, it crystallized her resolve. If Wilson couldn't lead, she would lead for him. If the cabinet tried to circumvent presidential authority, she would crush those attempts. If Congress demanded proof of capacity, she would stage-manage demonstrations that created just enough doubt to prevent direct action. The story only gets more complex from here. The treaty fight was reaching its climax. The Senate vote was approaching, and Edith Wilson, unelected and unauthorized, was about to make decisions that would shape American foreign policy for the next 50 years. If you're finding these constitutional cracks as fascinating as I am, subscribe so you don't miss how these pieces fit together. And if you're wondering what you would have done in Marshall's position, whether you would have had the courage to invoke disability provisions, drop your thoughts below. I read every comment. What emerged from the cabinet revolt that never happened was a new kind of American presidency, one where power could flow through unofficial channels, where constitutional ambiguity could be exploited to maintain stability at the cost of legitimacy, where gender and authority intersected in ways the founders never imagined. Edith didn't set out to revolutionize executive power. She just wanted to protect her husband. But in protecting him, she demonstrated that the presidency was more fragile and more flexible than anyone had understood. That the Constitution's silence on disability could be used to justify almost anything. That American democracy could function without a fully functional president, as long as someone was willing to make decisions and everyone else was willing to pretend those decisions came from proper authority. The cabinet had considered revolt. They'd contemplated collective governance. They'd discussed constitutional remedies. But in the end, they'd chosen complicity, not because they believed in Edith's stewardship, but because the alternative was scarier. Better to maintain the fiction than face the reality that their constitutional system had no good answers for this situation. Lansing's firing sent a message that resonated through Washington. The president was sick, yes, but he was still dangerous. Cross him, or more accurately, cross his wife, and you'd be removed. The remaining cabinet members absorbed the lesson. They stopped having unauthorized meetings. They stopped discussing constitutional remedies. They submitted to the system Edith had built, because resistance was futile and cooperation was easier. March turned to April. Wilson's condition stabilized at a new lower baseline. He could manage brief conversations. He could make simple decisions, but sustained focus remained impossible. Complex policy required more than he could give. Edith compensated by breaking everything into digestible pieces, presenting issues in short sessions, and synthesizing Wilson's fragments into coherent positions. She'd become expert at it, at reading his moods, at knowing when to push for decisions and when to simply make them herself, at crafting responses that sounded like Wilson, even when they came entirely from her own judgment. The forgery wasn't just in the signatures anymore. It was in the voice, the reasoning, the entire presentation of presidential will. And America continued, oblivious or willfully ignorant. The newspapers ran stories about Wilson's recovery. Political cartoons showed him resting while the nation waited patiently. The public narrative was one of temporary illness and gradual improvement. The reality was permanent disability and indefinite deception. But reality mattered less than appearance, and appearances, Edith had learned, could be managed. Behind the closed doors of the White House residence, Woodrow Wilson lived a life the American public never saw. The man who'd led the nation through World War, who'd negotiated peace treaties with European powers, who'd dreamed of a League of Nations that would end all wars, now spent his days in a wheelchair, struggling to remember what year it was. The morning routine began at 7. 2 nurses worked in shifts, caring for Wilson around the clock. They would help him from bed to wheelchair, a process that took nearly 20 minutes. His left side was dead weight. Moving him required careful coordination to prevent further injury. Wilson hated the indignity of it. Some mornings he would cry silently during the transfer, tears running down his face while the nurses pretended not to notice. Once situated in his wheelchair, Wilson would be dressed by his valet, Isaac Scott. The president had always been particular about his appearance. Now he couldn't button his own shirt. Scott would talk to him while dressing him, gentle conversation about the weather or the garden, anything to distract from the humiliation. Wilson rarely responded. But occasionally, on better mornings, he would make a joke. Something self-deprecating about being treated like an infant. Those moments broke Scott's heart more than the silence. Breakfast came at 8. Wilson could eat with his right hand, though his coordination was poor. Food often spilled. His dentures didn't fit properly anymore. Weight loss from the stroke had changed the shape of his jaw. Eating was a messy, frustrating process that left him exhausted. Edith usually joined him for breakfast, chatting about inconsequential things, maintaining a facade of normalcy. She would read him the morning papers, carefully editing out any political news that might agitate him. After breakfast, Wilson would be wheeled to a sunroom that overlooked the south lawn. This was his favorite spot. He would sit for hours, staring out at the gardens, occasionally pointing at birds or squirrels with his good hand. What he thought about during these long silences, nobody knew. Whether he was reflecting on his presidency or simply watching shadows move across the lawn, whether his mind was processing complex thoughts or empty of everything but present sensation, remained a mystery. Dr. Grayson visited twice daily. The examinations were routine. Blood pressure, always dangerously high. Heart rate irregular. Reflexes on the left side, non-existent. The right side showed some function, but it was deteriorating too. Grayson kept detailed notes that would never be published. They documented the president's slow decline with clinical precision, the gradual worsening of his speech, the increasing frequency of his emotional outbursts, the shrinking windows of mental clarity. Physical therapy happened each afternoon. A specialist would work with Wilson, trying to prevent muscle atrophy and maintain some range of motion in his paralyzed limbs. The exercises were painful and pointless. Wilson's left arm would never regain function. His left leg would never bear weight, but therapy continued because stopping would mean admitting there was no hope of improvement. Wilson hated physical therapy. He would become angry during the sessions, lashing out verbally at the therapist, at Grayson, at anyone within range. The stroke had damaged the parts of his brain that regulated emotion. He couldn't control these outbursts. After they passed, he would often cry, apologizing to people he'd just been screaming at. The therapist took it in stride. He'd worked with stroke patients before. He knew the anger wasn't personal. But here's what the doctors didn't document, what Grayson's careful notes never mentioned. Wilson had what neurologists would later call islands of lucidity, unpredictable periods, sometimes lasting an hour or more, when his old brilliance would mysteriously return. The fog would lift, his speech would clear, he would ask intelligent questions and make sharp observations. These moments gave Edith hope that he was improving, but they were cruel illusions. The islands always ended, the fog always returned. On January 8, 1920, Wilson had one of his best days in months. He woke alert and focused. He asked for writing materials and dictated a 3-page memorandum about League of Nations strategy. It was lucid, detailed, vintage Wilson. He cited historical precedents. He anticipated counterarguments. He outlined a path forward that showed sophisticated political thinking. Edith was thrilled. She thought perhaps he was finally recovering. 2 hours later, Wilson couldn't remember his secretary's name. He thought he was back at Princeton, preparing a lecture on constitutional law. When Edith gently corrected him, he became confused and agitated. The island had passed. The man who just dictated brilliant strategy was gone, replaced by someone who couldn't reliably track which decade he was living in. Edith learned to watch for the islands. She developed a sense for when Wilson's mind was clearer. His eyes would focus differently. His posture would straighten slightly. He would initiate conversation rather than just responding to questions. When she noticed these signs, she would immediately bring him documents that required presidential decisions. She had perhaps 30 minutes, maybe an hour if she was lucky, to extract whatever guidance she could before the window closed. The strategy worked, but it was exhausting. Edith couldn't predict when the islands would appear. She had to be constantly ready, documents prepared, questions formulated, ready to seize any moment of clarity. Sometimes, days would pass with no lucid periods at all. Other times, Wilson would have 2 or 3 islands in a single day. There was no pattern, no way to schedule around his disability. The evenings were usually Wilson's worst time. Sundowning, the doctors called it. As daylight faded, his confusion would deepen. He would become convinced he needed to attend a cabinet meeting or deliver a speech. He would try to stand from his wheelchair, forgetting he couldn't walk. The nurses would gently restrain him, redirect his attention, eventually calm him down. By 8 o'clock most nights, Wilson would be exhausted and docile, ready for bed. But not always. Some nights the agitation would continue for hours. Wilson would rage about the Senate and the treaty. He would demand to know why Lodge was being allowed to destroy everything. He would insist on seeing reports that didn't exist, about situations that had resolved weeks earlier. These episodes required medication. Morphine, usually. Enough to calm him without completely sedating him. Edith hated using it, but sometimes there was no alternative. The only consistent bright spot in Wilson's routine was the movies. Every evening at 6, weather permitting, a projectionist would set up in a small White House theater and screen a film. Mostly comedies. Charlie Chaplin was Wilson's favorite. He would laugh at the slapstick humor, sometimes the first genuine laughter of the day. For 90 minutes, he could escape into simple entertainment that required no complex thought. Edith would sit beside him during the films, holding his good hand. These were the moments when she felt closest to him, when the man she'd married was most visible. He wasn't the brilliant political theorist anymore. He wasn't the president who'd led America through war. But he was still Woodrow, still the man who'd written her love letters and made her laugh. The stroke had taken most of him, but fragments remained. Edith clung to those fragments. The cognitive testing Grayson conducted revealed the specific nature of Wilson's damage. His long-term memory was largely intact. He could recall events from his childhood with perfect clarity. He could recite poetry he'd memorized decades earlier. He could discuss historical events he'd studied as a professor. But recent memory was shattered. He couldn't remember what he'd eaten for breakfast. He couldn't recall conversations from an hour earlier. New information slipped away almost as quickly as he received it. This created strange situations. Wilson could deliver eloquent speeches about the Constitution, drawing on knowledge acquired years before the stroke. But he couldn't follow a briefing about current events. He could debate political philosophy at a high level during his lucid islands. But he couldn't remember the names of current cabinet members. His mind was like a damaged library. The old books were still readable, but the new acquisitions kept disappearing from the shelves. Edith exploited this pattern. When she needed Wilson to make a decision, she would frame it in terms of his existing knowledge. Instead of explaining new situations, she would connect them to historical precedents he already understood. Instead of asking him to learn new information, she would trigger his existing knowledge and guide his reasoning toward the desired conclusion. It was manipulation, though Edith didn't think of it that way. She was helping him, compensating for his disability, allowing him to contribute to decisions even though he couldn't fully grasp the contemporary context. The line between assistance and control was invisible. Edith crossed it regularly without noticing. By spring 1920, Wilson's daily life had settled into a predictable pattern: morning routine, breakfast, sunroom, physical therapy, afternoon rest, evening movie, bed by 9. Within this routine, he existed in a state that was neither fully alive nor completely absent. He could recognize familiar faces. He could express basic preferences. He could occasionally articulate complex thoughts. But he couldn't sustain focus, couldn't make sustained decisions, couldn't function as the leader of the free world. Yet that's exactly what he was supposed to be doing. While Wilson sat in his wheelchair, staring at the South Lawn Gardens, the government continued functioning in his name. Laws were signed with his signature. Executive orders bore his authority. Foreign policy was conducted under his direction. All of it filtered through Edith, who had become expert at translating her own decisions into presidential language. The staff knew. The nurses saw his condition daily. Scott witnessed the morning struggles. The physical therapist watched the deterioration. But they said nothing. Their loyalty was to the president, which meant protecting his dignity, even if it meant participating in a massive deception. They enabled Edith's stewardship by maintaining silence about what they observed. Grayson's role was most complicated. As Wilson's physician, he had a duty to honestly assess the president's capacity. As Wilson's friend, he wanted to protect the president's legacy. These obligations conflicted. The honest medical assessment was that Wilson was permanently disabled and should resign. But Grayson couldn't bring himself to force that conclusion. Instead, he documented the symptoms while supporting Edith's arrangement. He told himself he was giving Wilson time to recover. But months into the incapacity, recovery was clearly not happening. The moral weight of this deception was crushing. Every day, Grayson was lying by omission to Congress, to the press, to the American people. He would write in his private diary about the ethical compromises he was making, but he never broke rank, never went public, never forced a confrontation about Wilson's true condition. Years later, he would express regret, but in the moment, he chose loyalty over transparency. What Grayson and Edith understood, what the nurses and staff all knew, was that Wilson's quality of life depended entirely on remaining president. If he resigned, if he acknowledged defeat, he would lose his reason for living. The presidency was all he had left. Take that away, and he would simply give up. Better to maintain the fiction, even if it meant deceiving the nation, than to destroy what little remained of Wilson's will to survive. But the cost of that choice extended far beyond Wilson himself. American foreign policy was being shaped by a woman with no official role. Constitutional precedents were being set that would haunt future administrations. The Senate was debating a treaty without meaningful presidential input. The entire democratic process was compromised by a well-intentioned lie. In Wilson's more lucid moments, he seemed aware of this. He would look at Edith with an expression of profound sadness. Sometimes he would say her name and squeeze her hand. She interpreted this as gratitude. But maybe it was apology. Maybe he understood what she was sacrificing for him, what she was risking, what the country was losing. Maybe the islands of clarity included moments of recognition that he should let go, should resign, should free Edith from this impossible burden. If he had those thoughts, he never voiced them, and Edith never asked. They existed in a conspiracy of silence, each protecting the other from truths too painful to acknowledge. She couldn't admit he would never recover. He couldn't admit he was no longer capable of being president. So they continued the daily routine, breakfast and sunroom and therapy and movies, while America waited for a recovery that would never come. The invisible president lived invisibly, shielded from public view, protected from scrutiny, isolated in a bubble of medical care and marital devotion. The man who'd wanted to remake the world now couldn't cross a room without assistance. The leader who'd inspired millions couldn't complete a sentence without losing his train of thought. The president who'd promised a new international order couldn't remember what month it was. And yet, officially, he governed. His signature appeared on documents. His authority backed decisions. His presidency continued. Because Edith Wilson had discovered something about American democracy. It could function without a functional president, as long as someone was willing to forge the signatures and maintain the pretense. The system was more adaptable than anyone had imagined, and more vulnerable. The Washington press corps knew something was wrong. They just couldn't prove it. And in journalism, Suspicion without evidence is worse than ignorance. It makes you look like a conspiracy theorist. So reporters watched and waited and documented inconsistencies, building files of circumstantial evidence that never quite added up to a publishable story. The first red flag was access. Before October 1919, Wilson had been one of the most accessible presidents in modern history. He'd held regular press conferences, sometimes twice a week. He'd invited reporters into the Oval Office for informal chats. He'd even taken questions while walking to church on Sundays. Presidential accessibility was part of Wilson's political strategy. He believed in direct communication with the public through the press. Then, overnight, the access disappeared. The last press conference had been in August 1919, before the Western tour. After Wilson's return from the collapsed speaking tour, the White House stopped scheduling press availability. Requests for interviews were politely declined. The president needed rest, doctor's orders. He'd resume press conferences when his health permitted. Days turned to weeks, weeks turned to months. No press conferences. No informal chats, no Sunday morning questions. The only information about Wilson came through official statements released by Tumulty, or, increasingly, by Mrs. Wilson. Reporters tried everything to get access. They sent formal requests. They lobbied friendly senators to intervene. They even attempted to ambush Wilson during his rare appearances near a White House window. Nothing worked. The second red flag was the medical bulletins. In early October, Dr. Grayson had released a statement describing Wilson's condition as nervous exhaustion, requiring complete rest. Fair enough. The speaking tour had been punishing. Everyone had seen how hard Wilson was pushing himself. But as October turned to November and November to December, the medical updates became maddeningly vague. The president was resting comfortably. The president was following medical advice. The president was improving steadily. The president sent his regards to the American people. Always these generic reassurances. Never any specific information about his condition, his treatment, or his expected recovery timeline. Medical reporters who tried to ask Grayson specific questions got the same evasive responses. Louis Siebold of the New York World was one of the most persistent investigators. He'd covered Wilson for years and had good sources throughout the administration. In December 1919, Siebold began assembling a timeline of inconsistencies. Presidential signatures on documents that looked slightly different from Wilson's usual hand. Policy decisions that seemed out of character. The mysterious cabinet meeting in December, where Wilson had supposedly participated, but no transcript existed. Siebold's sources inside the White House were feeding him fragments of truth. A maid mentioned that the president couldn't walk. A Secret Service agent let slip that Wilson used a wheelchair. A kitchen worker said special pureed food was being prepared because the president had trouble chewing. None of these sources would go on record. All of them feared losing their jobs. But collectively, they painted a picture of a president far more disabled than official statements acknowledged. The problem was proving it. Siebold couldn't publish a story based on anonymous servants, gossip. He needed corroboration from credible sources. He needed documentation. He needed, ideally, to see Wilson himself and confirm the president's condition firsthand. In April 1920, Siebold got his chance. Through connections and persistence, he secured what seemed impossible: a private interview with President Wilson. It would be the only interview Wilson granted during his entire incapacity. Siebold prepared meticulously. He had questions designed to test Wilson's mental acuity. He planned to observe the president's physical condition carefully. This was his opportunity to either confirm his suspicions or prove them wrong. The interview took place on April 13th in the White House residence. Siebold was shown into a sitting room where Wilson waited in an armchair, positioned to hide his paralyzed left side. Edith sat nearby, close enough to intervene if necessary, but pretending to be absorbed in needlework. The president greeted Siebold warmly, his voice stronger than the reporter had expected. For 45 minutes, Siebold asked questions and Wilson answered. They discussed the treaty, Mexican relations, domestic policy. Wilson's responses were coherent and occasionally eloquent. He made jokes. He referenced historical precedents. He seemed, if not entirely healthy, at least mentally sharp and engaged. When Siebold tried to steer conversation toward Wilson's health, Edith smoothly redirected to other topics. Siebold left the interview convinced he'd been wrong. Wilson was clearly impaired physically, the positioning of the chair made that obvious. But mentally, the president had seemed fully capable. Sharp, even. Siebold wrote an article describing a vigorous leader, temporarily slowed by illness but clearly in command of his faculties. The article was syndicated nationally. It won a Pulitzer Prize. It effectively ended speculation about presidential incapacity. But here's what Siebold didn't write, what his Pulitzer-winning article never mentioned. The interview had been carefully orchestrated. Wilson had been prepared for days. Edith had reviewed likely questions with him repeatedly. The topics had been limited to areas where Wilson could draw on long-term knowledge rather than recent memory. And the interview had been scheduled for mid-morning, Wilson's typically clearest time. More importantly, Edith had answered at least a third of the questions herself. When Wilson began to lose his train of thought, she would interject with clarifying comments that allowed him to recover. When technical details were required, she would supply them, while Wilson nodded agreement. Siebold had observed this, but interpreted it as a wife helping her husband conserve energy, not as evidence that the husband couldn't sustain the conversation alone. 40 years later, after Siebold's death, his private diary was discovered. The entry for April 13, 1920, told a different story than his published article. "The man I interviewed was a shell," Siebold had written. "He had moments of clarity, but they came and went. Mrs. Wilson answered half my questions. When the president spoke, he sometimes lost his train of thought mid-sentence. I wrote what they wanted me to write. I am ashamed." Why did Siebold publish a false story? Partly because he couldn't prove what he suspected. Without admission from Wilson or Grayson, without documentation, any suggestion that the interview had been staged would sound like sour grapes. But also because Siebold, like much of the Washington press corps, didn't want to trigger a constitutional crisis. If he reported that Wilson was incapacitated, what then? A power vacuum? Political chaos? Maybe it was better to maintain the convenient fiction. Other journalists weren't as conflicted. J. Fred Essery of the Baltimore Sun had been tracking the story since October. He'd assembled a file of inconsistencies that he believed proved presidential incapacity, different handwriting on supposedly presidential documents, policy reversals that seemed inconsistent with Wilson's character, the mysterious absence of any photographic evidence of Wilson's recovery. In February 1920, Essery attempted to photograph the president through a White House window. He'd positioned himself with a telephoto lens, hoping to capture an unguarded moment that would reveal Wilson's true condition. What he got was a blurry image of a man in a wheelchair, his face barely visible. The photo wasn't clear enough to publish, but it confirmed Essery's suspicions. The president was wheelchair-bound. The White House was lying about the extent of his disability. Essery tried to publish a story based on his accumulated evidence. His editors refused. Without a clear photograph, without on-record sources, without irrefutable proof, they weren't going to accuse the sitting president's administration of a massive cover-up. It was too risky. If they were wrong, the paper would be destroyed. If they were right but couldn't prove it, they'd still be destroyed. So Esseri's story died on his editor's desk. The file of evidence gathered dust. The photograph of Wilson in a wheelchair never saw publication. The truth remained unpublishable, not because it was unknown, but because it was unprovable. The White House's strategy for managing the press was brilliant in its simplicity. They provided just enough access to prevent total information vacuum. A rare photograph of Wilson sitting in the sun, an occasional signed letter to a veterans group, the Siebold interview. These breadcrumbs of evidence that the president existed and functioned prevented the press from declaring him completely absent while revealing nothing about his actual capacity. Edith understood that journalists needed something to report. Complete silence would have forced them to speculate wildly. But controlled release of minimal information gave them just enough to write stories that supported the official narrative. The president was recovering. The president was working from his residence. The president remained engaged in governing. All technically true. All fundamentally misleading. The press photographers were the most frustrated. They wanted images of Wilson, proof of his recovery for their readers. But White House access for photographers had been completely eliminated. The few images released were carefully staged. Wilson seated at a desk, his paralyzed left side hidden. Wilson in an automobile, photographed from angles that concealed his wheelchair. Wilson at a window, distance and lighting obscuring details of his condition. One photographer, Harris and Ewing, managed to get onto White House grounds in March 1920 by posing as a gardener. He set up a hidden camera aimed at the residence windows, hoping to catch Wilson unguarded. For 3 days he photographed nothing but empty windows and occasional glimpses of curtains. On the 4th day, Secret Service discovered him and confiscated his equipment. The photographs were destroyed. The photographer was banned from White House grounds permanently. The most damaging evidence came not from professional journalists, but from visitors who'd actually seen Wilson. After the February meeting with Senators Fall and Hitchcock, both men were interviewed extensively by the press. Fall's public statement had been reassuring, but reporters who pressed him privately got different answers. The president was clearly impaired, Fall admitted off the record. Physically devastated, probably permanently disabled. But Fall wouldn't say that publicly because it would create a constitutional crisis he didn't want to manage. This became the pattern. People who actually saw Wilson came away shocked by his condition. But when pressed to make public statements, they hedged. They said he was recovering. They emphasized his mental clarity while downplaying his physical limitations. They protected the fiction because the alternative was too destabilizing. The conspiracy of silence extended beyond politicians and journalists. Wilson's own party had a vested interest in maintaining the appearance of presidential capacity. The 1920 election was approaching. Democrats needed to defend Wilson's legacy while positioning for the future. Admitting the president had been incapacitated for months would destroy any chance of Democratic victory. So party leaders visited Wilson briefly, saw his condition firsthand, and then publicly declared him vigorous and engaged. They praised his leadership. They predicted his full recovery. They assured voters that the president was handling the nation's business capably. Every statement was a lie. Every lie was politically necessary. The Washington Post ran occasional editorials questioning presidential accessibility. Why hadn't Wilson held a press conference in 7 months? Why were all communications filtered through Mrs. Wilson? What exactly was the president's medical condition? But these editorials were carefully worded to avoid direct accusations. They raised questions rather than making claims. They suggested impropriety rather than alleging incapacity. The reason for this caution was legal and practical. Accusing the president of being incapacitated was effectively accusing the government of fraud. It invited lawsuits. It risked access to all government sources. It could destroy a newspaper's credibility if the accusations couldn't be proven. So the press danced around the truth, implying what they couldn't state, questioning what they couldn't confirm. By summer 1920, the press corps had settled into frustrated acceptance. They knew Wilson was seriously disabled. They knew Edith was effectively running the government. They knew the official story was largely fiction, but they couldn't prove any of it to the standard required for publication. So they wrote the stories they could prove. Presidential statements. Policy decisions. Official activities. All reported as if they came from a functioning president. The irony was that the press's professional standards, their commitment to verifiable facts and on-record sources, made them complicit in the deception. If they'd been willing to publish based on circumstantial evidence and anonymous sources, the truth would have emerged. But journalism ethics prevented exactly that kind of reporting. So Edith's stewardship continued, protected not by the administration's skill at deception, but by the press's commitment to verifiable truth. What the newspapers didn't report, what their ethics prevented them from publishing, was that American democracy was running on autopilot. That constitutional governance had been replaced by an unprecedented improvisation. That a woman with no official role was making decisions that affected millions of lives. The press knew, they just couldn't prove it, and in the end, suspicion without proof was just noise. The Treaty of Versailles was dying. Everyone in Washington knew it except, perhaps, Woodrow Wilson. Or maybe he knew it too but couldn't accept it. The numbers were clear. The Senate didn't have the votes to ratify the treaty as written. Lodge's Republicans had enough support to block it indefinitely. Without compromise, Wilson's great dream would die on the Senate floor. Joseph Tumulty understood this. He'd been counting votes since November. He'd been talking to senators, testing possibilities, exploring what modifications might attract enough Republican support to reach the required two-thirds majority. By January 1920, Tumulty had drafted a compromise. It preserved the core of the League of Nations while addressing Republican concerns about American sovereignty and military obligations. The compromise was brilliant. It gave Wilson most of what he wanted, while giving Lodge enough face-saving reservations to bring moderate Republicans on board. It wasn't perfect. It would have limited American commitment to the League in ways Wilson found objectionable. But it would have gotten the treaty ratified. It would have gotten America into the League. It would have salvaged Wilson's legacy. On January 15th, Tumulty brought the compromise to Edith. He explained the political reality carefully. The pure version of the treaty had no chance. 0. Lodge had the votes to kill it. But this modified version could pass. It required Wilson to accept some limitations he'd previously rejected. But those limitations were far better than complete defeat. Edith read Tumulty's proposal carefully. She understood what he was offering, a political lifeline, a way to save something from the wreckage of Wilson's health and political capital. She could take this to Wilson during one of his lucid moments. She could explain the situation. Maybe, just maybe, he would see reason. Maybe the stroke had softened his infamous stubbornness. She scheduled a meeting with Wilson for the following afternoon, timing it for when he was usually most alert. She brought the compromise document and explained it slowly, carefully. Wilson listened in silence. His good hand gripped the arm of his wheelchair. When Edith finished, he looked at her with perfect clarity. His voice was weak, but absolutely firm. No, the treaty stands as written. Lodge wants to destroy the League. These reservations would gut its authority. America would join in name only, while maintaining the same nationalist isolation that led to the war. Better to have no league than a toothless league. Better to fail with integrity than succeed with compromise. Edith tried to explain the vote counts, tried to make him understand that without compromise the treaty would fail completely. But Wilson wouldn't hear it. His mind was made up. This was the one issue where the stroke hadn't touched his thinking. His position on the League remained absolute. That night, alone in her study, Edith faced an impossible choice. She could ignore Wilson's decision and pursue the compromise anyway. She'd been making decisions without his input for months. Why not this one? She could work with Tumulty to build Senate support, present the modified treaty for ratification, save Wilson's legacy despite his own stubbornness. But this was different. This wasn't routine government business. This was the defining issue of Wilson's presidency. The cause he'd sacrificed his health to promote. If she contradicted him on this, if she compromised his principles to achieve political success, she would be betraying everything he believed in. Even if it meant saving his legacy, the betrayal would poison whatever they'd accomplished. She made her decision. She took Tumulty's compromise proposal and tore it in half. She wouldn't overrule Wilson on this. She wouldn't compromise his principles. If the League was going to die, it would die on Wilson's terms, with integrity intact, even if that integrity meant total defeat. Tumulty pleaded with her. "Mrs. Wilson, this is the only chance. If we don't take it, the treaty is finished. Everything the president worked for will be lost." Edith's response was quiet but absolute. "The president has made his decision. We will support it." But here's what Tumulty didn't know, what wasn't revealed until decades later. Edith never actually showed that compromise to Wilson. She'd explained it, yes. But the document itself, with all its carefully crafted language, had remained in her hands. Wilson had rejected the concept of compromise. But he'd never seen the specific proposal. He'd never read the reservations that might have changed his mind. He'd made his decision based on Edith's summary, not on the actual text. Would it have mattered? Would Wilson have accepted Tumulty's compromise if he'd read it carefully during a lucid moment? Nobody knows. Edith destroyed the document. She burned it in the fireplace of her study, watching the pages curl and blacken. Whatever possibilities existed in that proposal died with it. The Senate vote approached. On March 19, 1920, the Treaty of Versailles came to the floor with Lodge's 14 reservations attached. These reservations limited American obligations to the League. They preserved congressional authority over military deployments. They protected American sovereignty while still allowing participation in the international organization. Moderate Republicans supported the modified treaty. Some Democrats did too. But Wilson had sent word through Edith. Democrats should vote against any version of the treaty that included reservations. It was all or nothing. Pure ratification or complete rejection. There would be no middle ground. The vote was 49 in favor, 35 against, 7 votes short of the 2/3 needed for ratification. If Wilson had released Democrats to vote their conscience, if he'd accepted the reservations, the treaty would have passed. America would have joined the League of Nations. Wilson's vision, compromised but realized, would have become reality. Instead, the treaty died. The League of Nations would exist without American participation. The international order Wilson had imagined would be built on a foundation missing its most powerful member. The irony was devastating. Wilson had fought so hard for the League that he'd killed it. His refusal to compromise had destroyed the very thing he'd sacrificed everything to create. Edith brought Wilson the news that evening. The Senate had voted, the treaty had failed. America would not join the League of Nations. She watched his face as she spoke, looking for some reaction. Grief, anger, regret. Instead, Wilson nodded slowly. He'd expected this, he said. Lodge had always intended to destroy the treaty. At least they'd fought for the right thing. At least they hadn't compromised their principles. He seemed at peace with defeat, or perhaps his damaged brain couldn't fully grasp what had been lost. The man who'd once understood political strategy with brilliant clarity now lived in a simplified moral universe where principles mattered more than results. The stroke had taken his capacity for political calculation. What remained was pure, unbending idealism. Edith sat with him in silence. She thought about Tumulty's compromise burning in her fireplace. She thought about all the decisions she'd made over the past 5 months, the signatures she'd forged, the cabinet she'd managed, the policies she'd shaped. She'd wielded presidential power in Wilson's name, making pragmatic choices to keep the government functioning. But on the one decision that mattered most, the defining issue of Wilson's presidency, she'd deferred to his judgment. Even knowing he was impaired, even suspecting his stubbornness was partially a product of brain damage, she'd honored his wishes and watched his life's work collapse because of them. Was that loyalty? Or was it the cruelest choice of all? Letting Wilson destroy his own legacy because she couldn't bring herself to save it against his will? The question would haunt Edith for the rest of her life. But in that moment, sitting beside her damaged husband in the failing light of a March evening, she told herself she'd done the right thing. She'd protected his integrity even if she couldn't protect his dream. The treaty's defeat marked the beginning of the end for Wilson's presidency. He had 1 year left in office. 1 year to watch everything he'd built crumble. The League would function without America. The international order would develop along paths he'd never intended. The isolationism he'd tried to overcome would reassert itself with renewed force. And through it all, Wilson would remain in his wheelchair, increasingly disconnected from the world he could no longer lead. The man who'd promised to make the world safe for democracy had failed. Not because his vision was wrong, not because his arguments were weak, but because his body betrayed him at the crucial moment. Because a stroke destroyed his capacity to make the political calculations necessary to achieve his idealistic goals. History would judge Wilson harshly for the treaty's failure. Critics would call him stubborn, inflexible, too proud to compromise. They wouldn't know about the stroke's effect on his judgment. They wouldn't understand that his rigidity was partially neurological. They would see only that he'd been offered compromise and refused it, that he'd had a chance to save his legacy and chosen principle over success. Edith knew the fuller truth. She knew Wilson's stubbornness had always been part of his character, but the stroke had amplified it, had removed whatever flexibility and political instinct he'd once possessed. The man who rejected Tumulty's compromise wasn't quite the same man who'd navigated American politics for 8 years. He was a simplified version. The core beliefs remained, but the capacity for strategic thinking had been damaged. Should she have overruled him? Should she have pursued compromise behind his back? Should she have saved him from himself? These questions had no good answers. Either choice was a betrayal. Contradicting Wilson's wishes betrayed his trust. Honoring his wishes betrayed his legacy. She'd chosen trust over legacy. She'd let Wilson make his own decision, even knowing that decision was influenced by neurological damage. Some would call that loyalty. Others would call it enabling. Edith called it love. And if love meant watching everything burn, rather than violating Wilson's principles, then so be it. The treaty America rejected had been Wilson's final chance for redemption, his opportunity to prove that his presidency, his war, his sacrifice had all meant something. Instead, it became proof of how completely the stroke had destroyed not just his body but his political effectiveness. The League would exist, but not as he'd imagined it. America would retreat into isolationism, setting the stage for another world war 20 years later. None of it had to happen. Tumulty's compromise had been there. The votes had been there. The path to success had existed. But it required Wilson to be someone he no longer was. Someone capable of strategic compromise. Someone whose brain could weigh pragmatism against principle and find balance. The stroke had taken that capability. What remained was pure principle, untempered by political reality. And pure principle, however admirable, had just destroyed the very cause it meant to serve. March 4th, 1921. Inauguration Day. Warren G. Harding would be sworn in as the 29th President of the United States. Woodrow Wilson's presidency was over. After 17 months of shadow governance, after countless forged signatures and stage performances, after decisions made in secret and truths carefully hidden, Edith Wilson's stewardship was finally ending. The transition was painful. Wilson had to appear at the inauguration ceremony. Constitutional tradition demanded it. The outgoing president rode with his successor to the Capitol, witnessed the oath of office, and transferred power peacefully. But Wilson could barely sit upright. His wheelchair had been modified to look like a regular chair when photographed from certain angles. Secret Service agents would need to support him the entire time. Edith dressed Wilson carefully that morning. His formal suit hung loosely on his diminished frame. He'd lost nearly 40 pounds since the stroke. His left arm had to be positioned artificially, held in place by the suit jacket, to create the illusion of normalcy. When he tried to speak, reminding Edith of something, his words slurred together incomprehensibly. She nodded as if she understood. After 17 months, she'd become fluent in interpreting his garbled speech. The ride to the Capitol was mercifully short. Wilson sat beside Harding in an open car, waving weakly with his right hand to the crowds. Most people were shocked by his appearance. The newspapers had reported his recovery. The official statements had described steady improvement. But the man in that car looked ancient and broken. Whatever recovery had occurred was invisible to the public eye. At the Capitol, Wilson could not climb the steps to witness the ceremony. His legs wouldn't support him. Instead, he waited in the president's room, a small office just off the Senate chamber, while Harding took the oath on the east portico. Edith sat beside him. Neither spoke. They could hear the crowd cheering outside as Harding became president. The sound felt very far away. After the ceremony, the Wilsons left Washington for their new home on S Street. It was a townhouse Edith had purchased, modest by presidential standards but comfortable. She'd prepared it carefully, installing ramps for the wheelchair, widening doorways, arranging the bedroom on the first floor so Wilson wouldn't need to navigate stairs. The house would be Wilson's prison for the next 3 years. He rarely left. When he did, it was for brief car rides around Washington. He would sit in the back seat, staring out the window at the city he'd once governed. Sometimes he would recognize a building or monument and comment on it. Other times he would remain silent for the entire drive, lost in thoughts he could no longer articulate. The public gradually forgot about him. Harding's administration brought new scandals and new dramas. Wilson became yesterday's news. An invalid former president living quietly with his devoted wife. Occasionally, newspapers would run stories about his health. Usually, they reported continued improvement, which was false, or quoted Edith about his daily routine, which was carefully edited to exclude anything that suggested serious disability. Wilson himself seemed content with obscurity. Or perhaps content wasn't the right word. Perhaps he simply no longer had the capacity to feel ambition or frustration. The stroke had simplified his emotional range. He could still experience joy, usually triggered by small things. A favorite meal. A funny movie. Edith reading him letters from old friends. But the complex emotions that drive political engagement had been damaged, along with his executive function. On February 3, 1924, Wilson died. He was 67 years old. The official cause was a stroke, though really he'd been dying slowly since October 1919. His body had simply taken 4 years to catch up with his brain's collapse. Edith was with him at the end. She held his good hand and spoke quietly about their life together. Whether he understood, whether he was still present in any meaningful sense, she couldn't say. But she stayed until he stopped breathing. The funeral was large but oddly impersonal. Presidents and senators attended. But few of them had actually known Wilson during his last years. They'd known the legend, the wartime leader, the idealist who'd tried to remake the world. They hadn't known the man in the wheelchair who could barely speak. That man had been Edith's private burden, hidden from history until death finally made concealment impossible. After the funeral, reporters asked Edith about her husband's final years. Had he been happy? Had he maintained interest in politics? Had he regretted any of his decisions? Edith's answers were carefully non-committal. He'd been as comfortable as possible. He'd followed world events with interest. He'd remained proud of his service to the country. All true in the narrowest sense. All fundamentally misleading about the reality of Wilson's diminished existence. Edith Wilson lived another 37 years. She died in 1961 at age 89, having outlived Wilson by nearly 4 decades. During those years, she carefully guarded his legacy. She cooperated with approved biographers while blocking researchers who asked uncomfortable questions. She donated Wilson's papers to the Library of Congress, but retained editorial control over what could be published. In 1939, journalist Ray Stannard Baker published the first major biography of Wilson, based on unprecedented access to presidential papers. Baker had free run of the documents, with only one condition. He had to submit his manuscript to Edith for approval before publication. She read every word and demanded changes to any section that portrayed Wilson's last years too honestly. The most significant revision involved the question everyone wanted answered: how much had Edith actually governed during Wilson's incapacity? Baker's original draft suggested she'd made substantial decisions. Edith insisted on language that minimized her role. The published version included her famous, carefully parsed statement: "I never made a single decision regarding the disposition of public affairs. The only decision that was mine was what was important and what was not." It was linguistic gymnastics, a master class in saying nothing while seeming to answer everything. The distinction between making decisions and deciding what required decisions was meaningless in practice, but it allowed Edith to maintain the fiction that she'd only been helping her husband, not governing in his place. But here's what historians discovered decades later, after Edith's death, when her papers finally became fully accessible. She'd kept a diary during the stewardship months, a detailed account of daily decisions, forged signatures, managed crises. Everything Baker suspected. Everything Edith had denied. Then, in early 1921, just before leaving the White House, Edith had burned the diary. Every page, every entry, every piece of evidence that might have revealed the full extent of her governance. She destroyed the historical record deliberately, ensuring that her version of events would be the only version available to future generations. What remained were fragments. Letters she'd forgotten to destroy, documents with signatures that handwriting analysts would later prove were forgeries. Testimony from people who'd witnessed the arrangement firsthand but whose accounts were dismissed as unreliable or politically motivated. The truth pieced together from these fragments painted a clear picture. For 17 months, Edith Wilson had functioned as president in all but name. She'd made policy decisions, she'd managed cabinet crises, she'd controlled access to presidential power. She'd forged signatures on everything from routine appointments to major policy statements. She'd staged performances of presidential capacity, while concealing the reality of presidential disability. And she'd done it all without legal authority, without constitutional basis, without acknowledgement or oversight. American democracy had continued functioning while its elected leader was incapacitated, because one woman decided that maintaining the fiction of presidential capacity mattered more than constitutional propriety. In her final interview, conducted in 1960 when she was 88 years old, a reporter asked Edith if she regretted anything about her stewardship. She paused for a long moment. Then she smiled, the same careful smile she'd perfected during those White House years. "I did what had to be done," she said. "Someone had to." And perhaps she was right. Perhaps in the chaos of Wilson's collapse, with no constitutional mechanism for addressing presidential disability, with a vice president too timid to assume power, and a cabinet too divided to function collectively, perhaps Edith's unauthorized governance had been the least bad option. Perhaps American democracy had needed someone to make decisions, even if that someone had no legal right to do so. Or perhaps the entire episode revealed how fragile democratic systems truly are, how vulnerable to individual ambition disguised as devotion. How easily constitutional procedures can be circumvented when everyone involved prefers comfortable fiction to difficult truth. How a republic can function without a functioning president, as long as someone is willing to forge signatures and everyone else is willing to look away. The 25th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1967, finally provided clear procedures for presidential disability. It specified how and when a vice president could assume power. It created mechanisms for determining capacity. It filled the constitutional void that had allowed Edith's stewardship to exist. But the amendment came too late for Woodrow Wilson, too late for the Treaty of Versailles, too late for the League of Nations, too late for the international order that might have prevented World War II. All those what-ifs and might-have-beens, casualties of a stroke that occurred in a constitutional system with no plan for exactly this scenario. Edith Wilson died on December 28, 1961, Woodrow's birthday. She was buried beside him in the National Cathedral. Her tombstone identified her simply as the wife of the 28th president. No mention of her stewardship, no acknowledgement of her 17 months as America's first female president in all but name. History would take decades to fully reckon with what she'd done, to understand the complexity of her motives, to separate devotion from ambition, to acknowledge both the necessity and the impropriety of her actions. She'd saved American governance from chaos. She'd also subverted constitutional democracy. Both things were true. Both things mattered. Thanks for staying with this journey through one of America's most closely guarded secrets. The fact that this could happen, that our constitutional system had no safeguards against this exact scenario, reveals just how much we take for granted about the stability of democratic governance. There are more untold stories like this, buried in the gaps between what history records and what actually happened. I'll see you in the next one.